Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. Always strikes me slightly weird having a session on wellbeing in the middle of an afternoon when you've been to loads of different sessions already, been either boiling hot or really cold, depending which room you've been in and so on. But I'm sure the sessions here will be interesting. As you can see on the screen, my name is Annalisa. I'm Professor of Education at St Mary's University. If you don't know where that is, it's a very small university, relatively speaking, in southwest London. One of its specialities is initial teacher education. And some of the research I'm going to share in this short presentation very much relates to work that we've been doing with our trainee teachers. As Dominic has said, I'm planning to speak for no more than 20 minutes. There would then be time for some questions if there are any. If there aren't any questions, I will just hand over to the next speaker. Just a few facts. Take a moment to look at those. I always think one of the best things to get started on any kind of research project is to be startled by something. Either startled or curious about something, and these facts startled me. They're from a Child Bereavement UK. Child Bereavement UK is one of the national charities looking at bereavement for young children and young people. There are many others, but the particular charity I linked up with for this piece of research is Child Bereavement UK. That report came out in 2018, and it it coincided rather, my reading of it, with the beginning of the pandemic. And at the beginning of the pandemic, one of our many partnership schools, we have about 500, 600 partnership schools across London, but one of them, a large secondary school, had 19 of its pupils bereaved of a parent in the first few months of the pandemic. I'll explain more why that happened. It just startled me as a number. And it led to a kind of a passion, if you can have a passion about bereavement. I think I have a passion about bereavement. I certainly didn't 3 or 4 years ago, so I'm quite surprised in that myself. But it led to a passion for bereavement awareness training or education for our trainee teachers. I wanted it to be more than that, a greater openness about death and dying, about normalising conversations about grief, loss, death in schools with children and young people. So in the period from 2020 to 2022, we offered, in collaboration with Child Bereavement UK, online sessions, just an hour and a half. If you go on the charity's website, they offer so much training for schools and other organisations. We offered all of our trainee teachers during that 2-year period, about 800 of them over that time, sessions about child bereavement. And from the feedback from the trainee teachers was overwhelmingly positive, and it meant that I really wanted to make sure that I could look into it in more detail. It led me to apply, and I would strongly encourage anybody here to do this, to apply for a BERA Small Grant Award. They're bound to come round again. In fact, I think the most recent one has just been advertised, so and gone, but look for next year's one. Small Grant Award, which allowed some research to take place. The report on the research that I did has now been published. You can see the document there. It's available on the website, so you can very happy to read it yourself. Exploring the impact of bereavement and grief on learning for all. It had to be on learning for all. That was the title of the BERA Small Grant Award. I was interested in a dual focus, really. I was interested in the impact on learning on children and young people in schools who experience a loss of any kind, really, but also on the new teacher, the trainee teacher, the early career teacher. What impact working with the child or young person in their class, what that might have on them and their own emotional development as a teacher in the process. The report itself has also led to a blog, which is a BERA blog, which will be coming out soon. So you might see some more about this in coming weeks. Research questions were very simple. I tried to get it's a very small research project, but how might bereavement awareness training as part of ITE enhance that professional learning? And how then, in turn, over time, might it support the learning of children and young people? And I also wanted to really have this subsidiary question, because you can train as many teachers as you like to be really good at certain things, a bit like we do well-being, how to look after yourself, how to manage your workload. But actually, if your school and the system doesn't allow you to do that, and they have unreasonable demands, you're not going to get anywhere. So it was important for me to see the systemic side of it here as well, but how schools were supporting teachers in general with bereavement training and so on. The First main questions, we invited all of our primary and secondary trainee teachers. We have undergraduate, PGCE, work-based routes. We have all kinds of routes into teaching at St Mary's. But they took part in an optional, and that's important at this stage, an optional online session, 1.5 hours, and then completed what felt to them largely like the evaluation of the session, but my research questions were interspersed in the evaluation. I was very mindful of not wanting them to evaluate the session and then have to complete a research questionnaire as well. Overall, 167 trainee teachers signed up, and 113 of them actually completed the questionnaires and provided really rich data for analysis. The second part of it, I sent a very short questionnaire, probably the shortest questionnaire I've ever sent anywhere, with only 2 questions to a randomly selected group of our partnership schools. As you can imagine, I was sending it to the head teacher, asking them to pass it on. As you can then imagine, return was very small, and I didn't chase. I specifically chose not to chase. I don't want to add to workload unnecessarily. But the responses, the small number of responses from schools provided also some very rich data and highlighted important themes. If I just give a little brief reflection on the literature, the last 2 slides of my presentation have all the literature references if you want to read anything further. But there were certainly some key themes that I was keen, from the literature, I was keen to see how they related to those early career teachers, the trainee teachers that we were working with. Several people have written about the impact on learning, focusing particularly on things like number of GCSE grades lower a child might get if they're bereaved in the early stage of their secondary school career. That kind of very, very sort of operational type of data about impact on learning. Some of them much more about the sort of social, emotional side impact on learning, that unless children are ready to learn, are feeling comfortable in their space, they will obviously find learning more challenging. The second theme that emerged from the literature is this one about the most significant impact being in less affluent areas. And I go back to that partnership school that I spoke about at the beginning. It's in a very disadvantaged part of northwest London. A lot of the pupils in that school, their parents were working in hospitals as care workers, ancillary staff and so on, working long hours with the pressures of COVID all happening. Of course, it wasn't actually that surprising that they were disproportionately affected by COVID, and sadly, 19 of those children lost a parent or a carer. Low confidence of teachers emerged throughout. This I found particularly interesting in that, having been a teacher educator, I couldn't remember a single time that I'd ever been to a session about how to manage or work with a child who's been recently bereaved. So I just thought that maybe things would have changed over time, but the research that I've done here shows that things haven't changed that much. We've still got a long way to go. There's also a certain amount of it needing to be proactive. One of the schools that responded to me later on, I'll refer to it in a moment, saying that they had a very, very strong bereavement policy in their school. It was part of their pastoral care policy. It was a subsection. They had loads of formulae to follow, flowcharts of what to do in what scenario. But it came as a reactive response to a very serious incident involving the death of one of the pupils on their way home from school. And you can imagine the turmoil that sent the school community in. So they were then reacting, but they are now in a proactive position because they have some of that in place. In terms of proactivity, there are other countries doing it better than us. Lutje mentioned there is in Denmark. Every school in Denmark has a bereavement policy, and they're constantly reviewing and analysing. So I think there's something there as well for us to tune into. In terms of time, it was timely because the UK Commission on Bereavement in November last year published Bereavement is Everyone's Business. Fascinating read. Covering all sorts of areas. There's a double page about education, but there's also one about the social worker areas. There's ones about undertakers and funeral directors. Really interesting read about how we're not really very good at talking about death in this country. It's still very much a taboo area. But the literature really does draw together the importance of how we can combine research, policy, and practice in these areas if we get it right. Before I share the findings, I'm just going to share with you what the focus group discussion went like. So we had the session. The students, the trainee teachers all gave their feedback. Questionnaires in tandem were going out to the schools, and I was getting a little bit of data back from them. The idea had been to bring together a small group of the trainee teachers to then explore in greater depth, and a small group of the senior leaders to explore in greater depth. But actually the timing of it, when it came to it, just felt wrong, because they were all on their main school placements, worried about core content framework, everything else they're trying to do, behaviour management, and it would have just felt an added burden. So we changed the direction of the focus group discussion. You can see here who was involved. There were 2 Child Bereavement UK experts, the 2 education people who had facilitated the sessions online for our students. We had 1 undergraduate primary trainee teacher who you're going to hear from in a minute, 1 senior ITE colleague, it's actually Jemima who's sitting in here, and the director from the Centre of the Art of Dying Well. We have a wonderfully named research centre at St Mary's called the Art of Dying Well. I think that's probably has to win the prize for the best research centre title. The findings themselves are quite interesting. They fall into what I would call 3 key areas, and I'm grateful to my colleague Steve, a research fellow at St Mary's, who helped with some of the analysis of the data. But they fell into 3 key areas. The actual training session, got lots of feedback about that, about professional learning in its bigger context, and then about the wider school context. So 98% of the participants, so of the 113 who replied, but the 167 who took part altogether, 98% of them said they felt more confident about working with a child who had been recently bereaved after just 1.5 hours of input. They just had more about the vocabulary. They learnt things like not to say that we've lost granddad, because if you're working with a 6-year-old, losing granddad is quite simple. You go and find him, for example. So there's a lot of input about language, which our primary trainee teachers in particular found very useful. They really liked the interactive nature of the session. There were lots of polls, there were lots of discussion in amongst it, albeit online, but it was the high quality nature of the session was crucial. And I suppose you can see some of the comments there from some of the trainee teachers. They liked the additional resources. They liked the language bit of it. They liked the links to the research. They were enjoying the connections with what they were doing, merging the theory and the practice, if you like, together. But what did come out of it was they needed it to be experts who led that session. So I've now sat through this child bereavement awareness training session in total 12 times, because I'm always there as the host for the university. I pretty much know what those facilitators are going to say on every single slide. I could probably run their session for them, but I don't have that deep knowledge and experience within the schools. And that's one of the themes that came out so strongly, that it needs to be experts in the field, because this is a sensitive and challenging issue. In terms of professional learning, I was asking them what had motivated them to participate in the session. As I said, it was optional at this stage. Lots of them, it was from a deficit response in a way, an anxiety, a fear about not knowing what to say, about panicking, about getting it wrong. They wanted to support the well-being and learning of pupils. But also of note, and this will be the same in any of the cohorts you maybe work with in initial teacher education, they also had experienced bereavement themselves, often as a child or young person. And I think they were anxious, understandably, of what triggers there might be in their own persona as a teacher when a child or a young person arrived at school on that day to tell them that somebody had died. All those emotional responses that we ourselves know only too well. The trainees received signposting to lots and lots of resources, and the second quotation there on that screen, the blue one, I think illustrates that. An initial teacher education programme can never cover everything. I mean, it's just not possible. But for our trainee teachers who've been through this, as and when, they'll know they've been to the session, they know where there are lots and lots of resources for them to go and follow up. And I think that's partly what we're doing. We're laying the foundations for people to go as they work their way through a teaching career. There was huge support for it to become compulsory. So now our challenge is to see whether we can get it embedded in the programme so that everybody, all of the trainees, take part in this session. And I think there's the final bullet point there that emerged from this is one that needs a bit more unpicking. There was a mixture of response between those who enjoyed the very theoretical bit and those who wanted the practical and the conceptual bit and those who wanted just practical. Tell me what I need to say to a child versus really understanding deeply what might be going on through stages of grief or whatever it might have been that the people were talking about. And I think that will, I mean, we could argue lots here about core content framework, I won't, but it's the learn that and learn how to part of it is quite a challenge. In terms of the wider school staff context, top quotation is someone who, one of my colleagues at St Mary's, a secondary maths tutor, who had taught in one of our partnership schools for over 25 years, and said to me, as far as I know, we've never had a session like this. He came to one of the sessions. He wanted to hear that session. I was expecting these themes to emerge, the themes on the screen now. They did, to a little extent, not massively, I wouldn't say. As I said already, the one school with a very robust policy in place, it was as a reaction to a crisis that had taken place. But I think if we can access some of these things, which are very much part of the UK Commission on Bereavements work, we'll be making a big difference for our schools. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the findings, but the recommendations at the end of it would be here, and I would ask, just challenge, I suppose, take these away with you, think about it. I would say that bespoke bereavement awareness training, not just general, but for early career teachers at the stage they are at in their development, should be a compulsory part. For illustrated, it can just be an hour session, hour and a half, and in fact, one of the outcomes of the research is that Child Bereavement UK are about to publish their ITE-specific bereavement awareness training, which is available to anybody, you know, with the donation, because they're a charity, obviously. Second one about leading by expert facilitators. I don't know what other sessions we think need to be led by experts. I would always say that someone from the university needs to be there, because we need to be able to follow up with our own trainee teachers if something happens. But having that authority, groups of people who are going in and out of school and dealing with death and grief in schools every day is key. I'm really interested in doing some international research around this to share learning more widely. And I'm planning a symposium spring, summer 24. I haven't got as far as getting a date ready yet. The people from UK Commission on Bereavement have agreed to be involved, so that's exciting. If anybody would like to contribute, then please do. But I'm going to leave the last word, really, to one of our trainee teachers. Well, I won't introduce her. She says who she is.
I'm Paige. I'm a third-year finalist primary education student at St Mary's University, and I'm really looking forward to starting my first teaching role in September. So I lost my dad when I was in year 6, which left me a bereaved child, very lonely, very isolated, and unable to cope due to the lack of training. So the school gave extra help with my SATs, revision lessons. I was taken out of class when I felt I needed to and removed from any activities to do with either deaf or parental guidance, like Father's Day and things like that. I feel like the school tried so hard to offer a sense of normality that it became so uncomfortable that everyone trod on eggshells and I stuck out like a sore thumb because it didn't want to be spoke about. I felt it was important to participate in these sessions to make sure I could offer the support that I didn't receive as a child, especially following COVID, that a lot more children are now bereaved in life. I think the biggest thing I took from the training session is it doesn't matter what you say, but say something to start those conversations, for a child to know it's okay for it to be sad and it's okay to be a normal situation. I think the schools need to raise the conversations. They need to start the talk of feelings. They need to talk about the process of life and the process of death and how children can become familiar with those feelings and accepting them, because a child will not start that conversation without an open door. Yes, I believe that bereavement training should be mandatory across the whole of the education system, as we're teaching kids how to get through life and to cope, and how to educate in every areas of their being. Why are we not educating in bereavement as well? I was very apprehensive because I felt it opens a box that's been closed for many, many years that I've never had to talk about. I've never had to express how I felt and what happened, because I learnt to get on with life and not deal with it. And I feel like it's helped me deal with it and move on from that part of my life. Yes, so I used bereavement training, and specifically the support that teachers can provide to bereaved children, as my dissertation and my research project through my final year. And this I look forward to take on and research more in a master's and join the pastoral teams of the schools. I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give as a trainee teacher, as a bereaved child, is to say something. It doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter why, just say something, acknowledge it, don't let it go unnoticed.
Thank you. Thank you, Annalise, and thank you very much for that session. My name's Paul Vare from the University of Gloucestershire. I'm very interested in well-being as a broader issue in education, and my interest is in sustainability and climate change and these issues. I'm just wondering how if you felt, or any feedback came, that that training, which is quite specific, is clearly very helpful and potentially life-changing. But do you feel that the teachers who receive that training in early career, in any way, does it support their wider practice, their sense of empathy, their dealing with children in less dramatic circumstances, perhaps, but more generally as just your part of your human and professional development? Absolutely,
and in fact, some of the feedback in the questionnaire evaluation at the end of it was very much around how the session would equip them to talk about other issues, particularly around loss or separation. So although there was nothing about separation, divorce, any of those kind of aspects, that is not really mentioned, but the same thing about talking about things openly, they absolutely would take through. It said, lots of them commented it helps them. They didn't talk about sustainability or climate crisis or any of those bigger issues, but I think acknowledging that children will be anxious and upset about things, and therefore we ought to talk to them and allow them time to talk back to us. Child Bereavement UK have an amazing library of resources, book recommendations, children's stories, books for teenagers on their website that are opening springboards for conversations. And I suspect you'll have the same in the sustainability kind of sphere. There are things that just act as triggers for conversation. But giving people the confidence to just go for something, say something, saying nothing is the worst thing you can do. And actually, since I've done some other research with a different hat on, nothing to do with children particularly, and they're saying that that's saying nothing. It's that fear. You see the person walking towards you on the other side of the street, and you know that their mother-in-law's just died, and you just pretend you haven't noticed them because you don't know what you're going to say. It's that exact, just say something. It came out so loud and clear from the training, but also from the responses from the trainee teachers. So I'm hoping at least that confidence will knock into other bits of life in school for sure.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of a parent. So my son lost his grandmother, age 8, as a sudden adult death, and nobody ever said anything in his primary school. So thank you from a personal point of view. But But linked to that, it's just a question about the training and whether it includes sort of an observation or a support for the other children in the class, because actually what started then was a series of relentless bullying, because he was suddenly a very different child, age 8, who understood that suddenly bad things can happen in the world, and his friends were just talking about football and things, and it set him aside from other children. And actually that's probably what he needed more than even a teacher acknowledging his grief, was a teacher being mindful of the impact on the other children. I was just interested in whether that was included in the training.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The training, I mean, it's an hour and a half. It's an online training session. They make it as interactive as they can, but it's only the first step. What we did in the second year of COVID was we offered the trainee teachers then additional optional sessions. Child Bereavement UK have a whole host of sessions. There's ones about having honest conversations, one about talking about bereavement with children with additional needs, talking about suicide, a whole range of additional sessions. This is very much the initial session, but it is talking about the impact of a death in what is a connected community of people. And you can imagine in a primary classroom, especially, I'm a secondary school teacher by background, but in a primary classroom, you know, someone comes in and somebody's died, well, then every child's telling you about the pet that's died, the grandparent that's died. It becomes this massive conversation that absolutely needs to be heard. One of the things that did come out, and again, I'd quite like to research it a bit more, is about the death of the teacher in the school. Because we work obviously with a large number of schools, and it happens frequently. The school where I'm a governor, one of the teachers has recently died quite suddenly. And the impact is massive, probably subconscious, but we need to normalise conversations about death at every opportunity, for sure. This is only a start in initial teacher education.
Thank you again very much. Thanks for the questions. We should move on to Lisa.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Annalise, for that initial presentation. I think you might see some connections with my presentation as well, which also focuses on initial teacher education, just in a slightly different way. So thank you all for coming to the session at 3:30, towards the end of our first day. I'm delighted to be able to present to you this work that I'm doing with teacher candidates. That's what we call them in Canada. We may know the terminology of trainee teachers or student teachers or pre-service teachers, but I will be using teacher candidate today. So my presentation is called In the Drift, Exploring Intersections Between Mental Health and the Arts in a Teacher Education Program. My name is Dr. Lisa Mitchell. I'm currently an associate professor at St. Thomas University, which is located in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. So if you know a little bit about Canada, Vancouver is on the west coast, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island is on the east coast, Ontario and Toronto and Ottawa are in the middle, and New Brunswick is almost all the way to the east coast. So I'm from Vancouver originally, but I currently reside in Fredericton, New Brunswick. So a little context about our initial teacher education program at St. Thomas University. So I'm in the School of Education. We are actually a very small university in comparison with other universities in Canada. We are a liberal arts university, and we only have 1,800 full-time students in total at our university. So it's a very small, close-knit, tight-knit community. Every year we graduate approximately 90 Bachelor of Education teacher candidates in a cohort, and they've completed an 11-month post-degree BEd program, which leads then to teacher certification in our province. And they'd be licensed to teach in the province of New Brunswick and then can transfer that teaching certification elsewhere. Our current teacher candidates mostly come from the Maritime or Eastern provinces, so New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. Some of them also come from other places within Canada, such as Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. Our program is very small. It works on a cohort model, and it's essentially designed to really have collaboration in mind. So with a cohort of only 90 teacher candidates, there's really nowhere for a teacher candidate to hide. They get to know each other very, very well, and we get to know them very well as their professors as well. We aim to be prepared with solid lesson plans, to establish positive learning environments for our students, to value and promote our professional responsibilities as educators, and deliver strong instruction through exemplary teaching practices. I'd also like to acknowledge at the top of my slide, part of the work that's happening in Canada at the moment is through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the federal government, is to indigenize our curricular spaces and, in a sense, decolonize them. So at St. Thomas University, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey Maliseet people, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy Peshkemutati tribes and nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. So I just offer that as a decolonizing acknowledgement of where this work took place. So the rationale for the small-scale study that I'm going to talk about is that within the School of Education teacher education program, in addition to our courses, we actually offer professional learning sessions on a variety of topics that fall somewhat outside the traditional courses. These are mandatory sessions that our teacher candidates engage in, much like what you were talking about with the bereavement. Topics are varied, so we have sessions on climate change education this year, for example, Black history, literacy and numeracy initiatives, Indigenous ways of knowing, and equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. When I first began my position at St. Thomas, I noticed that we didn't have a mental health professional learning session available. And so there was a sort of call to action for me as a new professor to figure out where some of my skills might fit outside of the normal classes. And so I took a look at some of the feedback that we had from our external review that happened on our program previously. And there was a real emphasis on adding more information for teacher candidates on mental health and wellness, particularly so they can serve their own students better in the schools. But by extension, the teacher candidates themselves also need more support for them. So as they're learning how to support their own pupils, who is actually supporting them with their own mental health and the needs that they have? So some of my previous arts-based research, which this will touch on today as well, is in areas of portraiture, classroom management, mental health, visual arts, and music education. It seems like a strange combination, but I tried to take all of those areas and create a mental health professional learning session that our students could learn from. So in terms of the actual study, the methodology and data, I put a few bullet points up here just to give you some context. Over the last 2 years, the data that I will be talking about today was collected from 180 graduates of our program. 2 cohorts at about 90 students each. They each completed a 3-hour professional learning session, or PL workshop, on mental health in the educational context. So it was a combination coming out of COVID of both virtual instruction and in-person delivery. In total, I've delivered this particular PL to about 360 teacher candidates, but the actual data today just comes from the last 2 years. So post-workshop participation, the teacher candidates were invited to write personalized, reflexive letters that focused on 4 themes. So I wanted them to do a bit of reflecting on what they had learned in a more informal way. So I didn't want them to write a paper for me. I just wanted them to write a Dear Lisa letter. And I asked them, not Dear Professor, not Dear Dr. Mitchell, but Dear Lisa, this is what I've learned. And I asked them to write about 4 things. So first, writing a personalized conception of positive spaces. What does that look like for them? Second, identifying the primary lessons learned during the workshop. What were the major takeaways? The third was imagining a mental health legacy to create as a newer beginning teacher. So the workshop was not meant to be their only training on mental health. It was meant to be a window in or a starting point. And then finally, what questions did they have? And how could they actually think about the assumptions that they had coming into the workshop that now might be different after they'd finished the workshop? So I then took those letters and I qualitatively coded them, and I found some emerging themes, and I thought I would share some of those with you today. The other part of the work I do is in arts education. And so I'm going to present some of the findings to you in an artistic way, and I'll explain that in a moment. The guiding research questions, again, just to frame a little bit more, what basic and complex characteristics do teacher candidates actually associate with mental health in the educational context? I didn't want to assume that I already knew what they were thinking. I wanted them to actually tell me about what they already knew or didn't know. How might teacher educators such as myself and my colleagues unpack, debunk, or otherwise utilize teacher candidates' understandings of those characteristics to then hopefully better prepare them as they go into our public school classrooms? And then finally, this is the piece that ties into the arts. How might an arts-based way of knowing enhance teacher educators' ability to guide teacher candidates' evolving understanding of the nature of mental health as it applies to those contexts? So as with the first presentation, I do have a reference slide at the very end of the presentation, but I just wanted to touch on some of the topics that have informed some of this work. So mental health in Canada, I've looked at both general and education-specific information. Mental health first aid, I'm actually a certified mental health first aid trainer. Maybe the expert, I'm not sure I can call myself an expert yet, but I do have the background training in that to offer these sessions to students. Some of the socio-affective needs of teacher candidates, professional learning communities and what they look like for new teachers, positive learning environments and collaboration in undergraduate contexts, and finally, some of the literature obviously comes from arts-based research and methodology. The methods and frameworks, which I will talk a little bit more extensively about, are based on the following. So I tried to take a very appreciative approach. If you've used AI, not artificial intelligence, which is now being talked about a lot, but appreciative inquiry, thinking about what is working in the sessions that we're offering, rather than thinking of a deficit model. I think that was really important to me. I also took some traits from portraiture, poetry as method, and writing otherwise. And again, the references are at the end of the presentation. So the three primary supporting frameworks, I like how these three connect together. They're a little bit artistic, they're a little bit different. They all focus on what we would call the good of a phenomenon. So what are the things that are working well? Particularly with portraiture, we're trying to get away from a very statistics-based mode of understanding. Instead we're like embracing the subjective. So we're trying to move away from that preoccupation with weakness or pathology. We're thinking about creative expression in interpretation of findings. You know, it speaks to teachers, researchers, and teacher educators who want to combine things that are both pragmatic and aesthetic and have the opportunity to learn in a conscientious way. And it's explicit in blending art and science and bridging empiricism and aestheticism. Poetry as method, which is the way I'm going to present some of the findings to you today. I rely quite heavily on Faulkner's work. I've just got the reference at the end, but thinking about the idea of found poetry was really important to me because I didn't want to speak for the 180 reflexive letters. I wanted those words to speak for themselves, but in order to do that, I had to take a vast amount of writing and parse it down into something palatable. So I'm going to actually share with you some poems that have come out of those letters today. And then I also like to rely on, Rebecca Luce-Kapler is actually a Canadian scholar working in Queen's University in Ontario in Canada. And she talks a lot about the writing process itself being the methodology. So, she asks the question, what does it mean to write otherwise? What would it mean to not always go to the standard traditional academically organized paper, but instead thinking about different ways that your words can have meaning? So I'll share 4 poems with you today that came out of the reflexive letters that I had the students write. And they are the following titles. These are my titles, not the students' titles, but the first one is called Foraging. The second is called In the Drift. The third is called Constellations. And the fourth is called Surface Tension. So what I'll do is I'll put the first one up and I'll just give you a moment to read it, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the findings that go with this theme. So foraging. Foraging. Disclosure is a funny thing. I can relate, but I shouldn't share. Really, though, I have a hard time doing nothing. Shutting it all off is my standard go-to. What if they knew about the meltdowns? Not theirs, mine. Then what, now what, so what? I need the what. And so normally if this was a more interactive session with more time, I would ask you what this poem means to you. I don't know if anyone wants to shout out what themes they think this would pertain to. Any ideas? There's no right or wrong answer. Okay, so I'll offer what some of the coded themes were that went with this. So the idea of disclosure as a new teacher, how much do you share with your new students? There was a theme of reaching out, of seeking assistance. There was a persistent fear apparent of potentially being looked at as weak, not prepared, or being a poor new teacher for being unprepared in this way. And a lot of the new teachers spoke about the struggle between the separation of teacher from who you are as a human being and how much you can actually share with your own students as opposed to the things that you should keep to yourself. They also spoke of the potential toll of living this kind of a differential and that they found it to be unsustainable and were worried about moving into the teaching profession. I think this speaks to retention as well in a whole other area, but the idea that they can't sustain the separation of the self from their actual teacher identity. The second poem I'd like to share with you for the second theme is called In the Drift. I'll just give you a moment to read. So this one for me has images of the ocean, and I'll explain that in a moment. It says, ambient noise shifts the feel of sand around my feet. Senses are engaged as I become alive in the present learning. Exhilaration, success emerges, but wait. Which sand dollars and rocks shall I select to represent such a significant shift that has happened? So a lot of the teacher candidates, when they were talking about a legacy moving forward, they were talking about struggling with getting so much out of a 3-hour session, but not knowing what the big takeaways were and what are the little precious things that they want to hold on to. And one of the students actually wrote about what it felt like as a child to be on the beach and the things that they were and were not allowed to take home with them, and how could they actually select what the most important items were. And so some of the themes in a more academic way would be new understandings about mental health when you find something beautiful on the coast. The volume or pace of learning, that the landscape is shifting and the waves are coming in fast and you may not be able to process everything that's happening. That teacher candidates experience a pressure to identify, and some of them said in quotation marks, the most important things. They want everything that they can get out of the session as quickly as possible and are maybe missing some of the subtlety as a result. And then finally, there was a lot of speaking to the shifting or unstable landscape surrounding mental health and wellness literature. I don't know if this is across the globe, particularly coming out of COVID, but new information every week or a new perspective or a new lens every week felt very overwhelming to some of these teacher candidates. The third poem is called Constellations. So this one is actually an exact excerpt from one of the letters, and it's a style of poetry called blackout poetry. So I'm going to read it for you. Work hard, positive mental attitude, depression from a young age, anxiety, debilitating, getting out of a dark place to think positively. Gained the headspace, challenging my thoughts. They aren't necessarily true. I noticed how often, a million reasons why, made me feel more stuck. Something clicked. I wasn't going to say I can't anymore. True, it felt. I can instead. Simple as it sounds, it took years to believe it. This agreement with myself, incredibly grounding. And so some of the connections here would be making connections between points of interest or information that they already knew and seeing them in a new picture. So I liked the idea of a constellation where you are removing some of the material that you can't see and you're only seeing the brightest points in the information that's being delivered. The students talked about seeing new pictures or perspectives, linking their experiences to their new learning or actions, parsing down the sort of influx of everyday things that they're bombarded with. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And they also asked questions about things that were missing or left unaddressed. So I think this style of poetry lends itself to the question of what is blacked out? What are we deciding not to share with other people? And I think it would be very interesting. I won't do it today, but if I showed you what actually was underneath the blacked out sections, it's quite interesting. So last but not least, I have one final poem, and then I'll just talk a little bit about some of the findings and how we're going to move forward with them. 2 slides left. Surface tension. I think I'll just, in the interest of time, read this one for you. It's peaceful and quiet, but there's too much noise. I'm always indoors, but I'd rather be outdoors. It's just too much, but I don't know enough. The struggle is real, but so is the success. I want to give, but who gives to me? Just do the right thing for them. If you can figure out what that is, someday I'll be able to, but what about today? And so I like that this was a lot of tension between 2 ways of being. The students spoke about the black and white polarization of their understanding versus a continuum of understanding what mental health looks like for them. It also speaks to the immediacy, I think, of the tech and online environment that our current students are living in versus what they might imagine mental health could look like if they removed some of those things. And then they also had a lot of tension between what their understanding would be from a more long-term point of view versus the practical things they need to say to the students in the moment of how they can help their own students. So last but not least, I have 2 slides to wrap things up. One slide just mentions a couple things to do with teacher education, and the other one just has a couple of bullet points about arts in general. For those of you that might be nerds in the audience and actually like Star Trek, I won't ask you to out yourselves, but the first line is actually the title of a Star Trek episode that my father and I were talking about something recently, and he said, "Who watches the watchers? Who teaches the teachers? Who helps the teachers?" So this came up a lot, is we are teaching them how to support their own students moving forward, but who is actually keeping an eye on them? Teacher education implication number 2, that we're looking at a complex mixture of both personal and professional needs. And the question is, whose responsibility actually is it to provide support, current and ongoing, for trainee or new teachers? This was an interesting thing that came up in the research about when they leave the training program, what happens then? Who is actually picking up that support for them? We also in here can see that there are inherently different needs than other groups at universities, such as undergrad students. For example, we have our next presenters are going to be speaking to the nursing context, same with teacher education. We're looking at a governing accreditation body outside of the university environment. Professional program students need supports that look different. They are older, they're more mature, for the most part, but they need something different, and what would that look like? And then the 4th thing I'm working through and considering is how to reduce the feeling of high-stakes environment for our new teachers. Do newly inducted teachers feel that they can ask for assistance? Why or why not? Are they simply being thrown into a sink or swim culture in a classroom? And do they feel they have the agency to actually question that and be able to reach out for the help that they need? And last but not least, if you are an arts-based mind like me, I just put 3 little musings up here for the arts-based perspective. So complex profiles and poems, they draw on things that are both pragmatic and practical, aesthetic and effective. It may actually prompt teacher candidates to think about a topic that might be otherwise difficult in a new way. So instead of asking them to read a research paper on mental health or bereavement or whatever the topic is, we can ask them to paint or write poetry and understand something in a non-confrontational way. For those who respond to aesthetic or arts-based modes of communication, these methodologies actually lend themselves very nicely to making us think differently. It's unexpected and it isn't always predictable. Bonus points for greater accessibility. If a research paper is something that your student cannot connect with, you may want to try something different. And then finally at the bottom, for those who do respond more appropriately to pragmatic or the practical application of research, this kind of research can really prompt you into making concrete changes, which is what I'm trying to do now because I'm on sabbatical this year. And one of the things I'm doing is redesigning the way we deliver professional learning in the area of mental health. I want to learn what I can from the teacher candidates and make changes that are going to help them moving forward. So last but not least, thank you very much for indulging my Canadian accent for the last 22 minutes. I will be completing some of these poems. I'm also going to be doing a visual art response. I work with another professor who is a painter, and we're going to be painting some of the student responses to these letters. I'm also interested in, again, redesigning and looking at how we can change our PL workshops moving forward, and finally connecting with others who are doing work in similar areas. If anyone would like to chat about that, I'd be happy to chat with you today. So selected references can be emailed if you are interested, and thank you very much. You have to ask your question in the form of a poem.
Thank you, Lisa. I was fascinated by that, having done in my own doctoral research, which was about resilience of early career teachers many years ago now, but getting the trainee teachers at that time to describe how they felt as trainee teachers at different stages, but through creative writing and poetry. I was blown away with how much deeper the responses were than they would have been to just a standard questionnaire. So really just thank you for reminding me of that. But can I just check, did you write the poems?
Some of these were unedited, like the Blackout poem.
Yeah.
It's just me that chose what to leave out. Some of them were a combination of more than one letter, but I mostly wrote these ones.
Yeah, no, that's but I just wanted to clarify that.
I tried to keep the words in the same order that they appeared in the letters to capture some of the authenticity, but then to put them together in a more poetic way. I think in the future I'd like to have the students write them themselves rather than me taking the letters after the fact and creating poetry. I think maybe that was a step I couldn't do this time, but certainly in the future.
No, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, and we'll move on to our
Great.
final presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Susie Guthrie, and I'm a academic nurse lecturer at Birmingham City University, and my colleague here is
Kat Sethi.
another academic lecturer at Birmingham City University. We're going to talk to you for the next few minutes, or maybe more than a few, on exploring our undergraduate student nurse experience of something called the A-Equip model. Have we got any nurses or healthcare professionals in the audience? Okay. That's helpful and in many respects validates what we've done with the first part of our presentation, which I'm going to run through very, very quickly, because without a brief overview of what this model entails and where it's come from, it's difficult to understand our research. So I'm going to go through things quite quickly for a number of slides, quick fire, and then Kat's got a bit more on the actual research that we've conducted. So the A-Equip model is advocating for education and quality improvement, and we're looking particularly at one element of it. So what is it? It's a model with 4 key elements aimed ultimately in the initial phases of it to support, in fact, midwives in the clinical practice environment. And it was brought in largely to support them and as a replacement for their statutory supervision. It has these 4 components: education and development, monitoring of our own quality control, clinical supervision, and these 4 components allow the professional advocate, trained professional advocate, to empower the people that they're working with to take personal action for quality improvement. And so that should influence ultimately the quality of care that is being delivered. Why is it actually important? Well, the formative element of the model, actually, next slide, sorry. Why use it? Why is it important? The first statistic on this is to say that we know that anxiety, depression and stress account for 19.9% of sickness episodes within the NHS, and that's quite staggering, really. And what the deployment of the model does is to, in the first instance, under the formative component, to develop personal and professional accountability, self-awareness, and to promote service improvement and quality of care. So that's your support for education here. The second top component, the normative component, in fact, allows you to evaluate, to accommodate, audit, and again, develops that accountability. And then the bit that really is key to deploying the whole model is the restorative clinical supervision element, which allows a safe space for discussion, for reflective conversation, supportive, challenging, and open and honest feedback. Now, for nurses and for student nurses, because this model came in for midwives in 2017, but was then introduced with a different focus for the nursing profession in 2021 in the wake of COVID. And the COVID took the joy for many out of their nursing. And what this clinical supervision element does is provide that space for people to explore their feelings and effectively, we hope, put the joy back into things. The personal action for quality improvement contributes to systems of quality improvement overall, promotes safety, and importantly involves the participants, the caregivers. Now, for student nurses, it allows for the opportunity for them to reflect and to embed learning. It does this for qualified staff as well, but also for students, it encourages them to address their emotional intelligence, and this is well supported by people called Pettit and Stevens and Patterson and Begley. So that's why we want to use AEQUIP, and our premise at BCU, which is, for those of you not from these parts, not far up the road from here, is that we've taken two components of the model and we've introduced it in a sort of package for our students. The formative element, we've looked at focused education, and that focused education has been based on the findings of our preliminary questionnaire. We've then combined that with the restorative element, which allows us to give targeted supervision sessions in small groups. And the idea with that is that we're providing students, we're getting them to use tools, which I'll come on to in just a moment, which they can practice using in small groups, and then hopefully they'll go on to use those tools later on in their practice, which will then allow them to effectively self-soothe or self-restore, so promoting that resilience. And students, and in fact our newly qualified nurses, potentially newly qualified teachers or other newly qualified graduates, should be resilient, confident, able to take that personal action for quality improvement, be it in their own lives, in the course they're undertaking, in their professional environment, and so develop in whatever field that they're working in. Our year one delivery looked a bit like this. We introduced them to the concept of AEQUIP and the fact that they might be subject to advocacy sessions during their welcome week. Very start of term for us, that's happening this very week. Cat and Ivy dodged a bullet there, I think. Our second run of sessions, and prior to the second box down there, the focused education, we asked them to complete a questionnaire, which we'll look at it in a moment. That focused education was a whole group. Our cohorts are roughly 80 to 100 students in size. And that was a large group session, and we looked at skills they'd need. So it was very much a skills-based practice on yourself, develop their communication skills, make sure they knew how to listen to one another, get them to pick out information. There's a fun one about a bus driver that we use with them, and then we asked them what colour was the hair, and effectively they're driving the bus. So it's that sort of thing we're using. We then went on, and they've got a practice placement mixed in amongst, in fact, two practice placement mixed in amongst this sort of session, and did a targeted supervision session combined with a focused education session. Because of the small group work and the size of the cohorts, we would need about 10 professional advocates in order to do the whole cohort supervision at once. So this was a means within our timetabling and curriculum overall running of bringing a whole group of 80 to 100 students in, and by splitting them in two, half does supervision, half does the educative bit, and then we cross them over halfway through the 2 to 2.5 hour session. So we did a targeted RCS session, then we did a second of the same but with a different focus. The first one we looked at using something called the circle of influence, which is whereby they sort of discuss their concerns and worries and look at what they can influence, what they can't influence, how they could change what they can't or don't feel they can influence. The second one, RCS session toolkit that we used was, looking at a shining moment, and most of them utilised, funnily enough, clinical skills that they'd actually done during their practice placement, things that were brand new to them, they'd never done before, and that exhilaration of successfully caring for a sick child and family and managing to achieve something as well as achieving an assessment. So that's what our Year 1 delivery looked like. Why are we here today and about to go on and talk to you about the research? Well, firstly, we're quite proud of what we've done. We're not yet sure that we've done as much as we'd like. We'll come on to that. Secondly, nursing as an academic discipline has focused largely on the influence on care and the evidence base for the care we're giving. And there's not so much about how we're educating our nurses that we're sharing in forums such as this, which could be relevant to other disciplines. And one of the reasons we're here is because we feel that the AEQUIP model has an application within the higher educational and possibly below that setting in terms of working with students from many other disciplines. So it's widely applicable across more than just nursing. Nationally, students are reporting low levels of well-being. There's the COVID impact in terms of what that did. I have no idea what happened in, say, Canada, but certainly in this country, there have been very high grades achieved in Leaving Cert exams. We've got students who maybe are on courses that are beyond their abilities. We've got students who were disappointed where they didn't have a grade as high as they might have hoped. We've now got a group who've just come out this summer in many instances, and this is based on some of my own experience. Some of the students have achieved grades that are lower than they would have perhaps expected to achieve. So they've not got to the course they wanted to, in spite of what I'm seeing on the news at the minute. We've then got the Gen Z approach. We know that that generation are less keen to read as generations before them have done, which in the higher education sector is crucial. We know they like bite-sized chunks. We know many of them don't want to work full-time and they don't want to study full-time. They have other things in life they'd like to be doing. And intervention by higher education institutions is both required and expected to support these individuals. This is how we think the model might look in the HEI sector. And I'd ask you to consider, we say that nursing students face unique challenges due to the nature of their courses, which involve practice placements and assessment within those practice placements, as well as learning and assessment in the more formal university setting. But are their challenges unique? Are they really that unique? We'll come back to that. So our research question, does embedding the AEQUIP model into a first-year undergraduate nursing curriculum support students to develop coping strategies to reduce feelings of stress and anxiety? And does this have a positive impact on academic self-efficacy and ultimately on their success? Kat.
So we set out to develop a research questionnaire, and we had some great support from the psychology department in doing that. The questionnaire is based on a range of psychological assessment tools, and I can provide the reference list at the end for all of those. Some of them we'll look at in a little bit more detail. But I think the important thing to note here is we possibly set out to assess more than we needed to, and certainly we found there was some conflicting influences.
Yeah, next slide. What we've ended up looking at, in fact, is we have effectively binned the connectiveness, the stress sensitivity and support categories. We're novice researchers, we freely admit that. Our focus in both our careers up until now, I've had a 50% career in the NHS as a children's intensive care sister. Kat, likewise, in a neurological clinical environment. And then we've moved at various points in our careers into the higher education sector. So I, for want of a better word, have been a jobbing senior lecturer. The focus has been on teaching and on delivery of teaching to big groups. Our institution's focus has focused a little bit more towards the research element now, and we're both very much enjoying that. But for that reason, we've sort of set off at a run, and we maybe should have slowed down a bit. Curriculum delivery for us is dynamic, and that's great, but in a large organisation and with large cohort sizes, what that effectively has meant for us is that we maybe didn't take full account, I'm going to say through no fault of our own, about things that could actually seriously impact the three themes that we have chosen not to focus on. And that's things like we learned recently that there are belongingness sessions running across the whole of the nursing cohort. That could influence how students feel in terms of their connectedness. They've got things like mental health and wellbeing sessions, which are running for our students and how they can take care of that. And that's coming at them from many angles, both from our mental health colleagues and from our health and wellbeing services. Other things that will conflict things for us are things like the personal tuition system. All of our students, because of the clinical environment they have fairly robust personal tuition and meet with their personal tutors mandatorily a minimum of 3 times a year. But many of my students choose to see me more often, and my door is open to them to talk about a range of issues. We'll debrief them on clinical episodes they experience. We don't offer academic tutorial support for assignments. That comes from our module teams, but often they will ask us for sort of general support. They can access our academic development department specific to our faculty. They can access the university-wide Centre for Academic Success equivalent. So there's lots of other stuff out there that they're free to access that may impact some of our results. The other 2 things that we're mindful of are BCU bills itself as the University for Birmingham. And for that reason, many of our students are the first in their families to come into higher education. Many of them live at home, and therefore they have robust family support and connectivity at home within the town. But for many of our child nursing students, it's peculiar insofar as we have the 2nd biggest children's hospital in the country and Centre of Excellence there for clinical excellence just across the road from this establishment. They provide most of our practice placement, and that is a draw from the rest of the country, from Scotland, from Wales, from the southwest, from London. Many students from London come to us. And for that reason, those students are far away and isolated. So we've got these sort of cohorts almost of 2 halves. So that can impact on their support that they're getting, and may impact in many instances on stress sensitivity as well. And then finally, we've got something which we haven't fully touched upon, and we're going to have to explore as we go through the next phase of this research, really, and that is that we have 2 intakes. We have a September intake, the findings of which we'll show you in a moment. We also have January intakes, and with our January students, we have done just the initial questionnaire, and that initial questionnaire looks quite different from our September intakes initial questionnaire, and our hypothesis behind that would be that our January students tend to be more resilient in the first place because they've often experienced a work environment before they start university because they've had this gap. Our January students also tend to be more of the students that may have taken a year and a bit between school and college. We're finding increasingly we don't have so many mature, in fact we have very few mature students in our September intakes these days. I'm the admissions tutor as well, and if I see a birth date for this year, if I saw a birth date of much before 2002, I'm thinking, oh, this person's ancient, and actually they're just hitting 20. So the bulk of birth dates I was looking at on this admission cycle that we're just completing now through clearing, in actual fact, they are all the 2004 to 2005 birth date, which is what I'd expect of a school or college leaver, sixth form college leaver. So that also can impact, and we're going to be very interested to look at our January cohort results because we think that there are quite a few variables in there. Yeah, go for it.
Before we show you any of the results, the first thing to say is that luckily we appear not to have made anything worse. We might have made some small improvements, but as you said, this is our first of 2 cohorts, and so our second cohort of data will be due in at the end of the month, and at the minute the numbers are too small for us to have a p-value, so we're hoping to come back to this when we've got just that second cohort. So first of all, we'll look at resilience, and thank you, Susie. The first thing is about resilience. When we were looking at tools and definitions, it was almost overwhelming in itself just to try to find out what resilience actually means. There's domains, dimensions, pillars, characteristics and types. So we went back to basics and we used the Smith 2008 Brief Resilience Scale. We just wanted to know, did the interventions that we put in actually help students to develop the ability to bounce back? And out of the 6 scores, they're positively and negatively worded, so we were quite confident that the 2 out of the 6 we had an improvement from was a genuine improvement. Small, but an improvement. And these are around the ones looking at the student's ability to snap back when something bad happens and recovering from stressful events. I think it's also important to say that although we've measured coping resilience and academic self-efficacy separately, they are all very much combined, and we did see that within this. And I think it's also worth noting that the fact that we only saw the improvement in two out of the 6 might not just be limited to us. There was an American study done in 2012, Taylor and Rees, that actually looked at over a long semester of American students. That wasn't enough for them to see an improvement in resilience. So it just goes back to the fact that we need a bit more time to review a little bit more data. The next thing we looked at was coping. And as you can see, so the orange is the closing responses, and there were some real improvements here, particularly around talking with others, facing problems head on, getting perspective on problems, and that letting their feelings out for stress reduction. And we were really pleased to see this, and these were also seen in the focus groups as well. But what we did notice was this self-blame, so that the students were more likely to blame themselves at the end of the year than the beginning. And I think, again, it depends if this is proven with a bigger data set, but it would be interesting to see if any of that can be linked back, because they will have just come back from their practical placements, to see if any links can be made there. And then with regards to academic self-efficacy, we were looking to see whether or not, so Cassidy, 2015, is talking about that the way that differences in perceived self-efficacy can actually potentially be better performers of achievement than better indicators of performance than previous achievements or even ability. So what we wanted to see is, was there anything to say? And actually, there was some improvements in their belief of their ability to research and complete academic tasks. And we felt, again, this was positive. However, we did notice this one at the end. You can see that the interest in academic work was less at the end of the year than the beginning. So if, given the second data set, if that actually is true, I think that also raises some really important points. There's a study that was done on some Korean students in 2018 by Soo Jin et al. That actually said that this trend might indicate overall dissatisfaction with their subject area, and certainly if that is the case of a beginning of a nursing degree, that's a really worrying trend. And in particular at the minute, we're looking at curriculum review overall for nursing.
We had a bit of a perfect storm with our current curriculum in nursing, because our overarching professional body, who actually set our course learning requirements, because we're not only offering a degree, obviously we're offering a professional registration, they were late publicising those in 2018, which meant that our launch date of our first ever iteration of the current curriculum was September 2019. As with most curriculums, it went out quite quickly. As I say, the standards came out, should have been out in May 2018. They were a little late being published, so we had a very short space of time to get these together. As we were launching that curriculum, we were ramping up for the first COVID lockdown. And during that first COVID lockdown, nursing students were disproportionately affected. I know higher education students were affected everywhere because things shut down. For nursing, it didn't. We moved online overnight and we deployed our senior students onto the coalface. And the anxiety and stress for the students in the first instance, and many of the lecturing staff actually in the second, who were trying to support these students remotely. At that point, I was working in placement development and support. It was one of the most challenging times, I think, ever of my career, and many of my colleagues. So the curriculum went off not quite as well organised. I think many of the staff, it is a very different looking curriculum from what we've run in the past. And we have acknowledged now that we need a major revamp, and that's currently underway, and what will launch next September, because we're going to have to go through an entire revalidation process, or a minimal one, I'm told, but I think it'll be major. So that's quite important to us, that we get that right. There's a bit of repetition in the course. Not everything is clear as it could be. So that feedback is not surprising, but equally it is concerning. We need to fix it quite quickly, and we're taking steps to do so.
And then we came on to the focus groups. So the focus groups were not particularly well attended. However, the students that did attend, we were able to gather some really meaningful data talking to them. And these are the themes that emerged from that. The quotes are up there for you to read, but I think that the main points here were that they spoke about the way they felt that they'd really developed as professionals and as people. They'd gained self-awareness. They talked about this having this ability to reflect. When you're looking at professional skills and attributes, what came through really strongly was about their ability to communicate and work as part of a team. And they spoke a lot about the anxiety that they felt around being watched by parents, for example, and talking to other members of the multidisciplinary team, and how the skills that they'd learned in these small group sessions had really given them the confidence to do that. And then the learning preferences, this was really interesting because we had a big discussion about whether these should be mandatory or optional. We went with mandatory. Even with that, we did not get full attendance, but the students actually said that if it wasn't mandatory, they definitely wouldn't have come, and that we must keep them mandatory so that more students can come back. So that was interesting. And there's also a very clear preference for working within small groups. They felt that this way they were able to talk and share and actually have some common understanding in those smaller groups.
Finally,
there was limited time, and I think, as I said, we possibly need to look at more of the 2-year data before we can come back with any real values around the numbers. We felt the tool was not ideal. As we said at the beginning, we kind of looked at too many different themes to assess, and we want to come back to that in 1 second. The engagement and attendance, it's not just the A-Equip sessions that's a problem that we are facing across all the modules, is this lack of engagement and attendance with sessions. The questionnaire, interestingly, didn't really match the sense that we got from the students. So whenever we have an RCS session, you check in and we check out. And anecdotally, we always see that the students will check in lower than they check out. They check out higher pretty much every time, but that wasn't necessarily captured within the questionnaire. So we want to see how we can do that, because we can't actually collect data from the RCS because of the way that the RCS is set up. It's confidential. And finally, the students, interestingly, were not able to identify what the A-Equip sessions were, but they could tell us what they took from them. So their kind of recall about what they did was interesting, and we're not sure what we need to do there. Susie.
Finally, and we know the discussion time is limited, 3 things. We think the model has a good application across higher education. We're all doing the formative stuff daily anyway. Education, personal growth and development, that's what we're fostering in our students. The students should have, it got lost a bit in COVID, it's coming back in, that voice in the normative function. They should be engaging in course monitoring and evaluation and giving feedback. There is an argument for introduction of far more restorative work with our students in the form of small group supervision, personal tuition, and empowering them to speak up and take their own action regarding their personal development, their course development, their life improvement. And this impacts within the higher education setting, students, courses, placements, organisations, and it has a strong application. We're seeing degree apprenticeships flourish, we're seeing placements abroad flourish, we're seeing students from overseas coming in a long way from home, and we're seeing far more work-based placements during degrees that are being run. Architecture has them, economics degrees that my son's looking at have got them. There's all they seem to be everywhere. So this A-Equip model, which could then impact the organisations higher education students are placed in, I think has a strong application. So the question we'd leave you with, 2 questions. One just for your own pondering, not necessarily to answer. Healthcare students face unique challenges to their discipline. Do they really? I think maybe across all students they do. But more importantly to us, has anyone got any ideas about how we can best assess the efficacy of this module in the higher education setting? Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. But while we're on your presentation, these links that you're making or beginning to make between healthcare and what I might call the more standard education that we're used to, really interesting. Vivian Bumfield, the president, has been pursuing some of those very overlaps in professionalism, you may be aware, and she mentioned it in the keynote this morning. So it's very much something that at that level BERA is interested in. And I know from my own, I mean, I'm a past president, but prior to that, I did a project, was a competitive tender that BERA issued called the Close to Practice Research Project. And we actually began with Trish Cook in 2005, whose her expertise was from the health sector. And it was the starting point for us. And we had an interdisciplinary team, and we tried as hard as we could to look at both the issues to do with how does research get used, received, worked with in the healthcare setting, but also obviously in more traditional education settings. So it's just an observation, and thank you. It got me thinking again. So if anyone else, yes.
Thank you. I'm not a nurse, I'm not a trained nurse, but I've just supervised a doctoral student that's looked at placements and the support of mentors. And it's really interesting to see how, although they're not aligned, there's some similarities there in terms of the identity of who they are in placements and how they navigate that and who helps them to do that. So it's really interesting what you're doing, but I don't have the answers to those questions. But I just wanted to say thank you, and I'll pass your details on to Catherine. She's in New Zealand, and she's a researcher in New Zealand for the nurse profession. So it might be something that you could both get together on.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, please do.